President Trump is just about 100 days into his second term, and I think no one could argue he hasn't been busy.
Tomorrow, tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico.
Air Force One is currently in international waters for the first time in history, flying over the recently renamed Gulf of America.
Since taking office, my administration has launched the most sweeping border and immigration crackdown in American history. We'll be ending the flagrant waste of taxpayer dollars. And to that end, I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Perhaps you've heard of it.
Talking to voters around Colorado, they seem just as divided over what's been unfolding under the new Trump administration as they were before the presidential election.
Well, I'm glad that he's moving quickly to do things, because his first administration, he didn't know who he could trust and who he couldn't trust.
I guess the best thing I can say, it's been a disaster.
I wish tariffs weren't that high, and maybe that would make groceries more accessible and not this expensive.
I've never been pro-Trump for anything, but I think closing the borders, one thing, working on the tariffs. I think that there's a step forward in finding all the fraud. I think we can't go forward if we can't take care of the fraud.
At this point, I disapprove. He hasn't shown any difference than what we just got out of.
With what I've seen, I think the work that's gone on in the military is very positive, because I serve, and I've seen positive effects through that, mostly throughout the DEI program getting removed. I know this workplace has been a lot more smooth, and there's a lot less stepping on eggshells.
Honestly, I'm terrified. As a business owner, I don't know what's going to happen. I have 9 people who depend on me, and I don't want to, let them down.
Love it or hate it, the president is giving us a lot to talk about in these first 100 days. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics and policy. I'm Benta Birkeland, and I'm here with CPR's Washington, D.C. reporter, Caitlin Kim.
Welcome to this live special episode of Purplish. We're recording the show in front of a live audience at the Buell Public Media Center in Denver. Thank you all for being here. And tonight, it's not just Benta and me on the stage. In a Purplish first, we're going to be interviewing 2 lawmakers from different capitals, different parties, and different chambers to get their perspectives and insights on this moment in American politics.
Yes, that's right. It's a Purplish first, which is exciting. And we'll have U.S. Representative Joe Neguse in the House, literally and figuratively. He's a Democrat in his 4th term in Congress. He represents Colorado's 2nd congressional district. This covers a big chunk of northern Colorado and the mountains, so from Boulder to Fort Collins to Steamboat and Eagle. Neguse is also part of Democratic House leadership. He is the assistant minority leader.
But first, to give us the State House outlook is State Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer. She's a Republican in her 2nd and final term in the Colorado State Senate and represents Weld and Larimer counties. She's also a former Weld County Commissioner and ran for Congress in the 8th Congressional District after it was first created and just narrowly lost the race. Kirkmeyer serves on the state's powerful Joint Budget Committee, making her one of the 6 lawmakers who write the state budget. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for reminding me about that race in 22.
My job.
So we are really interested in hearing what you have to say about Trump's first 100 days and the ripple effects of his actions, both big and small, here in Colorado.
Let's start with a general question, something I'm sure you could say a lot about. Big picture, what do you think of the first 100 days of the new Trump administration?
I think that he has been following through on his promises that he made on the campaign trail, and I think that's a good thing. I think trust in government was waning, and I think having a president who said, this is what I'm going to do, and goes out and starts doing it, I think that's good. I think the other thing that he has done that I'm not sure people are giving him credit for. And, I learned this. At one point, I was the state emergency manager operation for the state of Colorado, right? And, you make decisions, and if you make the wrong decision, you back up and you just make another decision and you keep moving. And that's what you should be doing in the case of an incident. And I think that is something that President Trump does. I mean, he likes to throw a lot of stuff out there, and sometimes it maybe doesn't land quite right, or it's not the best, or it didn't go the way he thought it was going to go. And I think he has that ability to back up and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't right, and go a different path. And I think that's a good thing. So I've been excited about some of the stuff that he's been able to work on and working and trying to find government efficiencies. It's the same type of thing that I do as a state senator, working on the Joint Budget Committee within our budget and where we're at.
So let's zero in on how Trump's signature cost-cutting effort is going. The Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, that's helmed by billionaire Elon Musk. And so far, they've fired thousands of federal employees, frozen billions of dollars in grants, made deep cuts to the U.S. Department of Education, Health and Human Services, and more. Senator Kirkmeyer, you have direct responsibility for crafting and helping to balance our state budget, which is a constitutional requirement that we have a balanced budget. How concerned are you that those federal cuts and potential future cuts in areas like Medicaid could impact the bottom line for Colorado and possibly impact services here?
There is some concern. But the reality is we haven't really felt them yet. I mean, I haven't seen what cuts you were speaking to with regard to the Department of Human Services or even actually to Medicaid. We've heard discussion about things, discussions about maybe how the program could be ran more efficiently or more effectively, but we haven't really seen those cuts here at the state level. I mean, I assume maybe some are coming because in every presidency, things like this happen. I mean, I will take you all the way back when I was Weld County Commissioner, and it was President Clinton and the welfare reform initiatives passed. And I think it was about 1996. That had a huge impact. The Fed started block granting funds to the states, and it impacted actually at the county. But it wasn't necessarily a cut in funds, it was a different way of how do we do business. No different than what President Biden did during the COVID experience that we all lived through, and even our own governor and the changes that were made there and those impacts. But let's just start thinking about how during COVID, the President of the United States at that time changed a whole bunch of rules, changed some things around, let people stay on, for example, on Medicaid without any redetermination as far as eligibility, changed the SNAP program, which is the food supplemental program, changed different things like that. And then just recently, over the last couple of years, again, not under President Trump, but under President Biden, we had what was called the public health unwind. That had a huge impact on Coloradoans and quite frankly across the United States, but that had a huge impact. And so I didn't hear anybody whining and crying about that so much other than it had a huge impact and how are we going to keep funding? Because at one point during COVID, 1 out of 3 people in the state of Colorado was on Medicaid. That's a lot. And that's a huge cost. And I think what everybody needs to understand is even, at the state level, we're in a structural deficit, and it's because of overspending. We received billions, and I mean billions of dollars from the federal government during the COVID experience and the public health emergency. And we spent those funds, and they were supposed to be spent as one-time funds. And then somewhere before I got on the Joint Budget Committee, we turned those into ongoing funds, and it's really messed up our budget. And so we're in a structural deficit. We've overspent. We need to stop our spending. I think the federal government has found themselves pretty much in the same place. I mean, we had about a $1.2 billion deficit in our budget. I think the federal government, and I'm sure the congressman can correct me, but I thought last I heard they're like at $37 trillion deficit. That starts impacting the economy as well.
Well, staying on Medicaid, though, as you have pointed out, it has become a pain point in both state and federal budgets. So how do you reform a program that both Republicans and Democrats believe is needed and that is relied on by a big swath of the population? Otherwise, they put up the cost of medicine going to emergency services instead. So how do you keep it from being financially unsustainable, both at the federal and state level?
I think you have to look at who the program is supposed to be serving. So I grew up in a very poor environment. I have 6 siblings. My grandmother, my great uncle were around the dining room table, 11 us around the dining room table. But we were always taught that there are always people who are less fortunate than you, and you're supposed to be working to assist them and help them out. And obviously help out the elderly, because we had everybody in our home kind of thing, and it's a generational thing. And it's back to where families took care of families type of thing. So, that's how I approach it as a state senator. Medicaid is important. That's why I was so greatly disappointed in Governor Polis when he brought forth a budget proposal that actually cut Medicaid providers. Didn't increase the Medicaid provider rate, which in effect is a cut. So it was kind of crazy because being one of only 2 Republicans who sit on the Joint Budget Committee, I was the one who was fighting to increase the provider rate. I was the one who's saying, no, we have to fund this for the, those that are the more vulnerable, the lower income, the less fortunate than us. But at the same time, over the course of the last 8 years, 10 years, actually, when did Obama come in? That's when things started changing with Obamacare and greatly expanded Medicaid. And there's a thing, as you're looking at the finances, whether it's your own pocketbook around your own dining room table, and how we look at it, as I look at it as a Joint Budget Committee, revenues come in, those would be your tax dollars, and the level of services have to be commensurate with those revenues. If it's flip-flop the other way, you're in trouble, which is where we're at right now, and I think where the federal government is as well.
Well, I feel like this might be a good spot to pivot. You're talking about costs and spending to another topic that's been in the news lately, tariffs. So the general agreement from economists is that tariffs will increase prices for consumers. Cost of living is a top issue for Coloradans across the political spectrum. How do you bring expenses down for people at this point?
So one of the bills I carried last year was to decrease property taxes. So that's how you do it. I mean, I have to work through, I am in the minority. There are 35 state senators, 12 of us are Republican. It's everything I can do to work to get bills passed. All my bills are bipartisan, but last year I carried both bills to reduce property taxes. So that's the first start. But really, we need to get our budget in line and stop overspending. All I have heard from my colleagues and friends across the aisle on the other side of the aisle is how bad Tabor is. I mean, in fact, I have one legislator, a good friend of mine, he's the chair of the Joint Budget Committee, likes to talk about Tabor, which is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and say that is why why government can't have nice things. And I remind him all the time that Tabor is the reason that people get to have nice things, because it keeps government in check, and it keeps government limited. And so trying to increase my taxes is not a way to increase or to make my cost of living better in this state, nor would it be for all the constituents that I have in this state.
Economic issues and cost of living were key issues for voters across the state this past election, across the political spectrum, as was immigration. We're seeing the impacts of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown across the state and country. And Senator Kirkmeyer, I'm curious, are you comfortable with how the Trump administration is pursuing immigration at this point? Are there ways you feel like they've gone too far, not gone far enough? What are your thoughts?
I think closing the border was a very good first step. I think it was a very necessary step. And then looking at it's impacting how we fund things here in this state. For example, last year, the number of children that were from undocumented immigrants that are in our state, we have an obligation to provide a public education to them. That starts impacting the children who are in our public school system, because now we have people who aren't speaking English. They're way behind, possibly not maybe even had any public education to begin with. And so last year we looked at funding additional dollars to our public school system so that they could deal with those impacts, both from those children that are here, are from undocumented immigrants, and also the children that are in our school system. So we just have to continue to look at ways to deal with the impacts and try and be as compassionate as we can. But I will say that, there are a lot of people in this state that we are supposed to be funding, that we have an obligation to fund and provide services to as state legislators. Those are the ones that are at the top of my priority list. Those are the ones that we need to ensure that we are looking to get services to that they need, critical core services. So that's education. It is back to the Medicaid. It's healthcare services. That's why, you asked me what I had for dinner. I literally walked out of the Joint Budget Committee and came over here. Before that, I was in committee presenting a bill to provide additional funding, $60 million worth of funding over the next 3 years to fund our our safety provider net, our healthcare safety provider net, because it's unstabilized. We are in critical mode with our healthcare infrastructure in this state, and we need to stabilize that safety provider net. Those are the types of things that I work on.
So when it comes to immigration, Republicans in Congress and President Trump himself have said they don't like Colorado's laws. The state has a number of other laws on the books that are likely to make the White House unhappy. That includes trans rights and gun laws. Senator Kirkmeyer, some Republicans are glad to see the Trump administration challenge state laws on these topics, which seems counter to me for Republicans who've always championed states' rights. So do you hope the Trump administration checks some of Colorado's Democratic policies, or would you like to see the administration prioritize states' rights, even if you don't agree with where those policies go?
So I served as a county commissioner, and I served as a county commissioner for 20 years. I served all the way up through 2020, so during the COVID portion. So, counties are an instrument, basically. A lot of things counties would have to do were mandated to us by the state. So during the COVID experience, I'm just going to give you my own experience in dealing with this in a different way. So dealing with the COVID experience, Governor Polis would issue, we called it the executive order of the day, because every day there was another executive order. And I don't know if you ever noticed in those executive orders, but he would always say the county commissioners, the counties will execute his executive order. In Weld County, we told him, no, we would not. Those are his orders. He can take care of them himself. That's why he has state laws. That's why he has state people working for him in state government. That caused a big ruckus, and at one point, Governor Polis told us he was going to pull funding from people in Weld County. We told him to go ahead. I'd like to know which constituent he doesn't want to fund. And he never did that, so it was a threat and that he never carried out, but at the same time, I just didn't think that was right. So I think the federal government has a role to play in addressing rules and addressing laws in our nation to make sure that there's consistency. There is funding that comes from the federal government. Yes, it has strings, no different than when the state passes through funding to counties. It has strings on it. You can either accept those strings and take the funding, or you can't. I would say in this case, maybe we should all stop poking the bear. Maybe we should all figure out how we can coordinate and work with the President of the United States, work with our congressional folks, whether that's Congressman Joe Neguse or my Congressman Gabe Evans. But we all should be trying to work together for the betterment of everybody who lives in our state. And at the national level, they need to be, taking care of the national people and of our national laws and determining what's best there for the nation. So I think we're better off if we all just try to work together instead of trying to just thumb our nose at people, poke them, do whatever, and just be obstinate about it. It's better off to let's just try to figure out how we make this work together instead of everybody trying to tell everybody what they're supposed to be doing or not doing.
There was a recent bipartisan poll, and it interviewed voters across Colorado based on voter demographics in this state. And this poll found that nearly 3/4 of voters want Republicans in Congress to act as a check on Trump. And the bipartisan pollster said this isn't new and it's not unique to the second Trump presidency, that checks and balances are something American voters have long said they want. In your eyes, when does the Republican Party act as that check?
The legislative branch is always supposed to be a check on the executive branch, whether it's at the national level or the state level. So I think that's their job. They're supposed to be putting that check on the president, just like it's my job to put a check on the governor.
Have you seen that in Congress?
I know, not that I'm aware of at this point. I think some are pushing back. I heard Congressman Crank speak the other day, again, with regard to the tariffs. I think everyone's concerned about the impact that would have on the economy, and I think that's their job. They should be putting a check on the president.
Okay, so for our final question, we're actually going to bring...
My final question?
The final question, we're actually going to bring Congressman Neguse on the stage because we wanted to ask this of both of you at the same time.
All right, bring him on.
So,
good evening.
What did you have for dinner?
I haven't had dinner yet.
Oh my gosh! You guys need to eat more.
All right, so our final question to the both of you, now that you're both here. From different parties, different levels of government, different branches of government, where can you find common ground to help Colorado? And State Senator Kirkmeyer, why don't you start?
All of my bills, with the exception of one last year, And it was because one of the Democrat sponsors decided to get off for some reason. But all my bills are bipartisan. So I have worked on bipartisan legislation to, one, reduce people's taxes. Today, the bill that I was carrying in committee today was with Senator Mullica, and it was to save the safety net is the name of the bill, to provide additional funds to those providers that are in our safety net of health care. So from my perspective, I started off my first year as a state senator working across the aisle to develop relationships and build those relationships. You know, I think there's an 80-20 rule. About 80% of the time, we're going to agree. So let's work on those things that we can agree on and make them even better for people in the state. Whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's lowering taxes. I mean, the list goes on. I tried to get rid of that goofy cage-free bill, you know, for eggs because it's increased the prices. And the chickens, I got news for you, those chickens are all still in it. Those chickens are all still in cages. But anyways, so I think it's about building relationships, understanding we all have differences. We all come from different backgrounds. Some of my best friends down at the Capitol are Democrats. That's okay. That's not a bad word. Compromise is not a bad word. Working together for the betterment of people in the state of Colorado, that's our job, and that's what we should be doing. And I can always find common ground on something to work with somebody on.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Senator Kirkmeyer's last point, and I think it's interesting. Notwithstanding all of the challenges and the controversies that we face, the vast majority of bills, as Caitlin knows, that make their way through the Congress into the president's desk are bipartisan in nature. And I've had the privilege of representing Northern Colorado, Western Colorado in the United States Congress for 6 years. And during that span of 6 years, I've served with Republican presidents, Democratic presidents in Republican-controlled Congresses and Democratic-controlled Congresses. And every term, our goal, my objective, my team is the same, which is to try to deliver for the people that I represent, which will often require building coalitions across party lines. Caitlin knows this, but one of the caucuses that I lead in the Congress is the Bipartisan Wildfire Caucus. And we have one rule, and one rule only, which is that you can only join the caucus if you join with a member of the opposing political party, which has kept it small, unfortunately. It's not the largest caucus, but the 22 members who are proud participants in the caucus understand that ultimately for us to get anything accomplished of consequence, it's going to require traversing party lines. So, yeah, I think there's a lot that we can work on together, from drought preparedness, wildfire mitigation, across the board. A litany of issues where there can be consensus built.
Can either of you think? Can I add
oh,
just a little bit more to that?
Yeah.
Because so I serve on the Joint Budget Committee, and you know about the Joint Budget Committee. It is by far the best committee to be on at the legislature, especially if you're in the minority. Because whoever put these rules together did a great job. Even though it's 3 senators, 3 House members, majority party gets to pick 2 from their chamber. So that's how we end up with 4 Democrats, 2 Republicans. But they can't meet unless a member of the minority is there. We can't pass what's called a Joint Budget Committee bill, which there are a lot of them, unless all 6 members agree to it. So it's a great bipartisan bill, or bipartisan committee. Everyone's got to work together, and you can't be outvoted by the majority because maybe, who knows, the minority might have some pretty good ideas. But it's a great committee, and it works really well.
I'm curious for both of you, in this heightened polarized environment that keeps increasing, has it made it harder to do that and tune out all the other stuff that's happening out there?
From my perspective, I would say for the first 6 years of my representation in Congress, notwithstanding, again, the challenges that we face and the polarization which has increased year after year, I still felt like, by and large, we could get important, big things done on a bipartisan basis. Clearly, the last 3 months, which I'm sure we'll talk in greater detail about, have created a different dynamic in Washington. It's tough to reach bipartisan agreements when the executive is dismantling branches, different agencies within the executive branch, or completely ignoring or undermining the Article I powers that we have under the Constitution as a Congress. And so that creates a different dynamic. I would say your larger point is a salient one. Barb and I both have the unique experience of having run cabinet agencies in Colorado. A long time ago, for Governor Hickenlooper, I ran DORA. And even then, with a Republican state Senate and a Democratic state House, could find common ground and find ways to build progress collectively. So things have always worked a little bit differently at the state level. And I think, if anything, I've tried to make the case in Washington that we ought to emulate how things are done here in Colorado. But I've had varying levels of success. And right now, again, as I said, I think the environment is a pretty toxic one nationally.
I would say, and I'm not going to speak for the House at the state capitol, because they're a little bit crazier than the Senate. There's more of them.
That applies for Congress.
That's true.
More lawmakers, more problems.
No, it's well said.
But, no, in the Senate, it's very respectful. We have rules of decorum, and people stick to them. And you can be opposed to someone's bill. I'll just give you an example. Opposed to a bill that Senator Julie Gonzalez had. She's a Democrat from Denver. And the next bill up on the docket that we're both down there debating is our bill that we're doing together. And so, you just have to learn to let go, right? You work your bills, you work them hard, you have good reason why you're carrying those bills. You have great reasons. I'm sure we all have great reasons why we're opposing certain bills. But then when you move on to the next bill, you just move on to the next bill. I mean, in the Senate, I keep asking my caucus members, what's our end game? Sometimes over in the House, they think their end game is to try and just filibuster until midnight. I think at 9:30, I'm tired and I need to go home. And so, but in ours, the end game is, how are we going to get our points across? Do that in a respectful manner. Make sure that we're representing the people of the state of Colorado, because even though we're elected from districts, same as Congressman Joe Neguse, we serve everybody in the state of Colorado. And that should be our end game all the time, is how are we going to do the best job we can to serve the people here.
Well, great. Well, on that note,
am I done?
Let you go.
Yes, you have another meeting to go to.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, State Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer, for joining us.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
Now we're here with U.S. Congressman Joe Neguse to put him on the hot seat and ask him a lot of questions about the first 100 days of President Donald Trump. We'll start with a broad question first, which is, a lot's been happening in this first 100 days. You're down the road from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. What do you think of President Trump's first 100 days?
Look, I think by any empirical measure that an American would use to evaluate the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, it has been a disaster for the public, for American citizens across our country. By every economic measure, we now, if we're not already experiencing a recession, will be experiencing a recession in short order. Prices are going up across the board as a result of the reckless tariff taxes that the president has pursued. Unemployment is beginning to tick up. Things are getting more expensive for the people that I represent in Lafayette and Fort Collins and Eagle and across the district that I'm privileged to serve. That is to say nothing of the attacks on the rule of law, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and the ways in which I think this president is undermining really core norms that have been, for the better part of 250 years, considered sacrosanct, and now we see are very much on the chopping block. So I could go on. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here in the audience, because I could spend quite a bit of time talking about, in my view, the mistakes that have already been made that are having real-world consequences for the people of Colorado, and I think that's a tragedy.
So, Congressman Neguse, according to a recent bipartisan poll of Colorado voters, 83% of Democrats and about half of the unaffiliated voters say they want Democrats to oppose Trump as much as possible. And they don't think Democrats in Congress are trying hard enough to limit Trump's agenda. Is that fair?
I would say this. I think that the president adopted very clearly a strategy from the outset of flooding the zone, issuing unlawful, unconstitutional executive orders, every day, kind of more tumultuous than the day that preceded it. And that clearly was done in a way that perhaps a lot of folks didn't anticipate. And that includes, folks in Congress. And so we have all, I think collectively, had to recalibrate how we respond to what is essentially an unprecedented circumstance. We haven't had to deal with a president who is seeking to unilaterally dismantle agencies of the federal government like the Department of Education. That has required, I think, a level of creativity on the part of congressional Democrats, right, that was not asked of prior generations of lawmakers. And so I think it's fair for the people of our state, for Americans writ large, to expect their representatives to oppose unconstitutional actions and to use every tool that we have at our disposal. And that has been an evolving process, and it's one that's going to continue to evolve as we prepare to respond to the latest iterative actions of the Trump administration that may violate the Constitution.
Colorado gets a lot of federal funding, and the Trump administration has been very aggressive about using the threat of taking away federal money to try to get institutions to fall in line with his policies. If he really turns that tactic on states that oppose him, knowing that Democrats are in the minority, like you said, what do Democrats do about that?
So a couple things that we'll do. First and foremost, I think we are far afield from a president working in concert with the Congress to leverage the powers under the Commerce Clause to implicitly compel states to take certain steps. This is not that. This is an executive that believes that he's above the law and has no responsibility to abide, in my view, by the Constitution. So were he to take the steps that you've described, one, I think state governments would certainly have legal recourse, and I think a very compelling legal argument to say that what the executive is trying to do is unlawful. By the way, we've seen this, of course, over the last 3 months in the context of law firms, right, that have been targeted by the administration via executive orders that are ultimately litigating those in federal court. You see this with respect to nonprofit organizations that have been the target of the president's illegal impoundment of funds, universities in that same vein. So I do think that there is a judicial recourse. Legislatively, the Congress is going to have to reassert itself as a co-equal branch of government. And as you both know, we are in the minority, Democrats that is, in the House, but only by 4 votes. Which is to say that if 4 House Republicans were to stand up and simply say that they don't believe it's in the best interests of their constituents that funds for the universities and research centers in their districts be impounded, then we could stop those actions. And the same extends to the point you made about state government. So I think making the case in the court of public opinion with the hope that our Republican colleagues, or at least some of them, will begin to see the light and the writing on the wall and recognize that if there were ever a time to stand up for the Constitution, now would be it.
You talked about Article 1 powers of Congress. One of that is the power to levy tariffs.
Yes.
I know that you and other Democrats have
and some Republicans
have been very critical of President Trump's tariff policies. But there are a lot of Americans that believe U.S. trade policy needs to change. What is the Democratic vision for trade at this point?
Yeah, I think that it's an important question, but here's what I would say. There's a time to have a reasoned debate on the merits about how to effectively use tariffs as a surgical tool in pursuit of a trade policy that centers American workers and the like and ensures economic progress and mobility for every American. That is not what is happening today. Literally, you have a president who in the morning declares a 40% tariff and by the end of the day reverses himself and the very next day does it all over again, creating mass economic uncertainty, price increases that are going to permeate the broader economy over the course of the next few months and years that will be debilitating for countless Coloradans, job losses that will be coming by virtue of the recession that Donald Trump has essentially engineered. And so from my perspective, I've been asked a similar question around kind of my views on what is the right tariff policy. And what I would simply say is that this is not that, again. And I'm open to a debate on the merits about what a smart, tariff and trade policy looks like. But first, we're going to have our Republican colleagues join us in imploring the administration to pull back from the brink before we go into a great recession, far more cataclysmic than what the country experienced a mere 16, 17 years ago, as many of us will remember in 2009.
Okay, so economic issues and cost of living, as you know, were key issues for voters this past election, as was immigration. We're seeing the impacts of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown across the state and the country. From both Benta and my conversation with voters before the election, even people who were Kamala Harris voters, were unhappy with the number of migrants crossing the border. Has the Democratic Party gotten out of step with the public on immigration enforcement?
I'd say a couple things. I don't want to speak broadly for the Democratic Party. I can speak for myself and how I view these issues. First, I would say I view it through the lens, as you know, Caitlin, of my own family's history. But my parents were immigrants to this country. They came here 45 years ago, and because of the freedoms and the opportunities that we have here in the United States of America, they were able to live the American dream and see their son, one generation removed, serve in the House of Representatives. And so from my perspective, I think we are at our best as a country when our immigration policy is rooted in the core American values that we all hold dear, of being a beacon of hope and of liberty and freedom to the world. And I think what the president is doing is clearly inconsistent with those core American values. Perhaps the most confounding part for me about the immigration debate in general is that I actually think if you asked 10 Coloradans, asked 10 of my neighbors in Lafayette or in Grand Junction or Colorado Springs, every corner of our state, to solve this challenge, I think you would generally get the same answer from the vast majority of folks who would say, yeah, I think that we ought to secure our border, and we want to have a secured southern border, that we don't believe that we should have criminals, who are immigrants here in the country, that we also believe we should protect our dreamers, kids who've known no other country as home but the United States, farm workers, folks who are contributing to our economy and our way of life. There's a reasonable compromise to be had applying those principles that I just described. And yet, the president has weaponized this issue to such a degree and demagogued it because I don't think there's real interest, unfortunately, in my view, on the other side of the aisle, of solving this challenge. It's more about the politics of the moment. And so it has been a very frustrating experience for me as a congressman, as a citizen of our state, as a son of immigrants, to see a policy area where I actually think that we could get to a resolution if we operated outside of our silos and actually were willing to come to a compromise. By the way, there's a model for this. Senator Bennett, years ago, was part of the Gang of Eight in 2013 that articulated a vision for a common-sense immigration policy for the 21st century. That bill passed the Senate on a bipartisan basis and had Republicans that back then who controlled the House put that bill up for a vote. It would have passed by an overwhelming margin and would have solved so many of the challenges, or at least ameliorated so many of the challenges that we're experiencing today. So, again, this is one of those areas that I just find deeply frustrating. Obviously, what's happening now, the Trump administration's complete disregard for due process and the rule of law should, in my view, shock the conscience of every Coloradan.
Congressman, you've talked about the first 100 days of this new Trump administration being unprecedented. Has your party met this moment?
I think that is an open question. I don't know that that's one would be a question for me to answer. I think it's a question
you can reflect on it.
The voters, yeah. Well, no, I have my views, but I think ultimately the judgment would be rendered by the citizens of our state, citizens of the country, the voters, of course, right, in the next election. And I also think that we are in month 3, all right, or month 4, I suppose, soon. And so as a result, it is very much in my mind an open question. And I am less interested. I mean, obviously, I am a proud Democrat and proud to be a Democrat, but I'm far more interested in how we respond as a country. Every American, irrespective of your political affiliation, in this moment. It's not so much, in my view, viewed through sort of a partisan lens. It's a tall order. It is a tall order. We're facing some circumstances that certainly no one alive today has, sort of confronted when you think about some of the ways in which this administration is undermining the Constitution. And so it's going to require all hands on deck, everyone participating and engaging in our democracy. You see that in protests, and we just yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, the days kind of blend in, but we in Boulder went to NOAA and NIST because we heard from community members and others that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, personnel had arrived on the campus and had heard disturbing reports about their potential activities. And in virtually a moment's notice, there were hundreds of people who had gathered at outside of NOAA and NIST to stand in solidarity with these federal workers who are our neighbors, right? Fellow citizens, fellow Coloradans doing incredible, breathtaking work on our behalf. And we had an opportunity. We decided that I would go and see for myself what was happening, and had an opportunity to visit with the personnel on site and determined that the DOGE personnel had not arrived. But the point is, going back to the core nature of your question, it's going to require us all to engage in ways that we haven't had to before. Years ago, it would have been as simple as, irrespective of a Republican or Democratic administration, picking up the phone and calling to determine whether or not something like that was happening. Now, that is no longer the case because of the way in which this administration is approaching, the current circumstances.
All right. Well, Congressman Neguse, thank you very much for joining us for this live taping of Purplish.
Yes,
we really
you.
do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Benta, we've still got a few minutes in the studio here, and I want to check in on what we just heard from our guests. Personally, I think the most interesting thing to start with is what they said when they were both here together and talking about how they do try and find bipartisanship, because I feel like, at least from where I sit in Congress, you don't always see that. Like, they try to, but the things that get all the air and the oxygen are the divisions.
I mean, I certainly obviously follow what you do at the federal level, and we hear from state lawmakers is that Colorado's not DC. And yes, there are elements of that really deep division, but overall, I think, to Kirkmeyer's point, the Joint Budget Committee is very bipartisan, and a lot of lawmakers on most bills are working with other members. There still are personal online social media attacks in a way that wasn't the case when I was starting out in journalism. Twitter wasn't even a thing back then, and now it's X. But that hasn't derailed things, at least at the State House level. For the most part, people are trying to keep their personal attacks and opinions out of the debate. It does happen a lot more frequently than it used to, but not as common.
And I will say, I think the other interesting moment for me was when State Senator Kirkmeyer, when you asked her that question about when Republicans serve as a check, because Republicans in Congress, there have been very few of that, and she sort of said, well, that's Congress's job.
And then when I said, have you seen that? And she said, essentially, no, I haven't.
And I think it shows sort of the loyalty, at least at the federal level, and amongst the Republican Party in general, to Donald Trump, and that for all the people that might not like what he's doing, there is a really large number of Republicans who are very supportive of what he's doing, that he is, in fact, as she said, he's moving forward on the issues that he campaigned on, and is actually, as he likes to say, promises made, promises kept.
One thing I'll be looking out for are those voters who backed Trump but aren't diehard MAGA supporters and wanted to see lower cost of living, wanted to see certain things in their lives improve. And I've already started to hear from some of those folks like, yeah, I'm kind of liking what I'm seeing, but what's the economy going to do? When am I going to see prices go down? What's going to happen with tariffs? So I think there will be a lot of voters that are undecided at this point, even people who voted for Trump, giving him a chance and liking what they're seeing. But when will that shift? Or maybe it doesn't shift.
The point that Representative Neguse was making, this is still early. It's 3 months in. There's a lot that can happen between now and next November, especially when it comes to issues such as the economy, prices. I think one issue where there has been success for Trump is immigration, but in polling you have seen, his ability to handle the economy drop, and I think that's going to be a major driver again next November. That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Benta Birkland.
And I'm Caitlin Kim. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf, and our editor is Megan Verlee. Sound design and engineering by Shane Rumsey. Our theme music is by Brad Turner. And a big thank you to Rocky Mountain PBS for partnering with us for this event.
Purplish will be back in your feeds next week. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.